Welcome to the Profile Corner. In today's video, I'll be working on a table for the 3D printer that I bought a couple weeks ago. I can't have this out in the shop because it'll get full of sawdust and that won't be good for the high-speed movement of this unit. And so I'll have to build a table so that I can put this into a shed to keep sawdust off of it. I had been putting a garbage bag over the top of this to keep it out into the shop, but that's not a very good look, I don't think. It kind of sends the wrong signal to the printer that of what I think of it. It really does a nice job, and I think I'll probably be using the 3D printer to print little feet to go on to the bottom of the table legs to keep them off the concrete. And so hopefully that'll make the table legs last a little bit longer. We like to use black walnut for shop fixtures and whatnot. And so that's what I'll be using today. I have some black walnut here that I can use for the legs. As you can see here, this board is roughly 6 inches wide, and it's roughly 3.5 inches tall, or slightly less than that tall, in rough form. And the unfortunate thing is that it has the pith of the tree almost in the center of the board, and obviously it'll be in a different position in a different board. And of course this board is only about 2 feet long, so I'll have to use a board stretcher on it to make it long enough for the legs. So anyway, we've got this, and I'll be using some other black walnut that's currently in rough form. I'll have to scan that black walnut using the metal detector to make sure that there's no embedded steel or bullets or anything like that in the wood. So that'll be part of the process before I pass the wood through the jointer and the planer. And so we'll get started on that in a couple minutes. I have not yet developed a build plan for this. I'll likely be upgrading this Prusa MK4S at some point to a Core 1. I'm not certain that I'll be doing that, but that'll have a full enclosure on it, which could change the space requirements for it. This particular printer, it looks like it needs about 2 feet of space side to side, and it also needs roughly 2 feet of height, and then also front to back, that's also very close to 24 inches. So it's 24 by 24 by 24, and I thought, well, it's probably not a good idea just to build a table that's 2 feet square, because what if I ever get another one of these, or I need space next to this to set prints or something like that next to it. And so what I think I'll do is I actually build a table so that it's 2 feet wide and 4 feet long. And because I need to have storage for the plastic filament before I use it, I need to allow space for this on a shelf below the main table. And so let's see what the dimensions are of this. And it looks like that'll take up about 8.5 inches top to bottom. This one, which is a different brand, this requires a little over 9 inches. And let's see, front to back, we need about 8.25. And this one, front to back, needs about 8.5. And then depth-wise, this needs a little bit less than 3 inches. And this requires a little over 3 inches of space. And so I've got to allow for that. And so I've got to do a little bit of work yet to try to develop a little bit more of a plan before I get started. I'll be using mortise and tenon joints because when this printer starts moving, it does a lot of shaking side to side and front to back. And so I need something very stable. I can't just rely on simple joints like pocket screws or even butt joints. I need something with a little bit more of a positive hold than pocket screws, and that's why I'll be using mortise and tenon joints. And so I need to get this printer out of the way so I can get started working on milling up the raw lumber. The black walnut that I have I found that it has a little bit of cherry mixed in with that. And so if I end up milling up a board and it ends up being cherry, I'll have to set that aside. And but I can work around with that. That's not a big deal. I think with these legs, what I can do is I can make the legs for the table 2 inches square, which may allow me to get a table leg out of this area here just to the side of the pith. But of course it's going to depend on where the pith is at on the other boards that I use for the table legs. So I may be able to get one leg here and another leg here, and of course the length. And I want to make this table just as tall as my regular workbenches are. And if I get a quick measurement here, I've got a height of 34.5 inches as the standard height of my workbenches. So I want to make this workbench just that high. And if I make the plastic foot on the bottom of the legs a 1/2 inch tall or something like that, or a 1/4 inch tall, then I'll have to subtract that height from the height of the legs when I create them. Okay, so I'm going to get this printer out of the way, get it out of the shop so it doesn't get dusty, and then we'll go over and we'll start checking the boards for metal. Okay, here's a rough sketch of the drawing for the table. And the side view will be essentially similar to this, except that it will be 24 inches wide instead of 48 inches wide. There's an end-to-end warp in this board where there's quite a bit of a curve this way, and this is roughly the halfway point. I measured that spot, and that's a little bit less than 48 inches from the far end down here. And so if I want to use this end for the tabletop, potentially, then I need to actually shift that point over a couple inches, as you can see right there. This other end has some damage to it. Looks like some bug damage or something like that. And so I'd want to use this other end potentially for the tabletop. I'm not sure if I'll be able to get the tabletop out of it, but I'm going to take a shot at it. So I'll go do a cut right there on that line. And once again, that's just a rough cut, roughly 50 inches from the other end. And now I'll just go through the same process for the rest of the boards, trying to get rid of the end-to-end warpage in the boards so that when they go through the jointer, I still have enough wood left over to actually use for one of the boards in the project. Now I've got some boards that are quite wide, like this one. This one measures 14 inches wide, at least at the one end. I'll have to cut this board down in width a little bit so that I can get it to fit over my jointer and into my planer. I'll probably have to take it down to about 11 1/4 inches wide to go across the jointer. And fortunately there's quite a bit of a taper on these boards on the sides. This is a live edge board essentially. And so what I can do is I can take my portable circular saw with a straight edge and just cut down the length. And I may not even use that straight edge. I may just make a mark on the board using maybe a 4-foot level or something like that, and get it cut down so that it'll pass over the jointer. I'll also need to cut this in half lengthwise because once again it has a warpage in it lengthwise. And these boards were all air dried, and I actually applied a coat of boric hair on all these boards between 1.5 and 2 years ago. And so now what you need to do is brush that boric hair off as much as possible, just in case it acts as kind of like a sandpaper abrasive on the cutter knives, on the jointer and the planer. I wouldn't want that damaging the knives, and so I've got to try to brush these boards down as best as possible to get as much of that boric hair off the surface as is possible. So I'll be working my way through this stack, and then I'll head over to the jointer next to go on to the jointing process. And it looks like this board got attacked pretty badly by bugs. Hopefully there's something useful in it still. It's not looking good. Okay, now we're ready to run the boards through the jointer. of chips to clean up here. I'm surprised how many of those boards actually ended up being cherry. In the rough, with the boric hair on the surface, you really couldn't tell the difference between cherry and walnut. And obviously once the one surface is planed away, or jointed away, it becomes quite clear what's cherry and what's black walnut. Hopefully I've got enough black walnut for the project. Yeah, I've got to get started over at the planer as soon as I get the mess cleaned up here on the floor of all the chips. It wouldn't be safe to continue operating with all these chips on the floor. I have all the chips cleared up off the floor now, and so we're in pretty good shape to start doing the planing. I'm not going to show the planing operation. As soon as I get done planing, I'll send the boards through the drum sander to bring them down to a final thickness of 3/4 of an inch. I'm hoping that I didn't take off too much material at the jointer trying to flatten the one side in order to be able to make straight boards. So hopefully there's enough material left here to take off at the planer so that I can achieve a 3/4 inch thick board. All the boards that are here are black walnut. The boards that are in the back here were actually cherry, and so that's a little disappointing that I had misidentified the boards when I stacked them up a couple years ago. And of course I've got these boards here that I'll be resawing down to 2 inches square. Now planing is done now. I've got a couple boards that didn't quite clean up all the way. I may be able to sand that out. I have not yet passed these through the drum sander yet, but I may be able to clean that up so that I can use that other side rather than this side here. I'm really impressed with how this Foley bell saw 12.5 inch wide planer does, as well as the wide jointer insofar as not having any chip out with just straight knives. Now the planer has carbide tip knives and the jointer has steel knives. The steel knives and the jointer are set at a very fine angle, which probably helps reduce the amount of chip out that you get. But there's really no chip out that I can see in any of these boards. I did end up with quite a bit of cherry here. The cherry board's all cleaned up, but the cherry has quite a bit of bug damage in spots, whereas the walnut fared much better. Some of the sapwood in the walnut has some bug damage in it. I guess that's to be expected with walnut on occasion in the sapwood. I ran the large post through on edge on the planer so that I've got these surface 4 sides, whereas these other boards are all surface 3 sides. I'll have to break away for today because I'm out of time, so I'll sand these tomorrow and then we'll pick up with resawing these boards down to make the 2x2 legs. And depending on how it looks, I may actually go larger than 2x2. I may go 2.5 by 2.5. I haven't decided yet. The concern that I've got is that if I don't take off equal amounts of wood on both sides, then the board could warp a bit once it's cut down, and so that could be a concern. Of course, that's going to happen when I cut this 2 inches wide and then I make another 2 inch wide cut. The amount of moisture in the wood may not be fully equalized, even though these boards have been drying out for years and years in the shop. I'm ready to cut the leg blanks out of these boards, and so far I've got rip fence set to 2 11/16, which should essentially split down the middle this board, and I'm hoping that I don't get a lot of curvature in that direction. And I've got the blade up as high as it'll go, which is about 3 1/8 inches. These boards are 3 1/16 of an inch tall, so that could present a little bit of a problem when I'm trying to cut them down. I've got both of these boards cut to 40 inches long right now, and so With these boards being 2 and 11/16 inch wide after they're cut, what I'll probably do is cut them down to 2.5 inches after I see how the boards react in terms of the curvature that they end up with after the cut. Hopefully they stay straight, and if they do, then I'll cut them down to 2.5 inches square. If they don't, then I'll have to run them over the jointer again and then try to achieve 2.5 inches square. I have a 24-tooth carbide brick style blade installed right now. Board had a bit of tension built up in it, and so it's good that I had this rip fence with a splitter and also the Jessam's sock guides to help keep these boards from going backwards. See there, I got quite a bit of burning due to the tension. So now what I need to do is check these boards to see if they're straight, and if they're not straight, then I'll have to joint them again, and then I can cut them the other direction. And in this case, when I do this cut, I won't be cutting essentially down the center, and so I could get additional movement shortly after the cut's made, if not immediately when the cut's being made. Okay, so now what I need to do then is take these boards over to the jointer, joint the faces that have been cut at the table saw here, just to make sure that they're straight. Then I can cut these boards down to 2.5 inches square. I won't film that. Yeah, I just finished jointing the boards and running them through the table saw here to try to hit 2.5 inches wide, and I'm off by a couple thousandths. I'm at 2.502 square, so that leaves 2 thousandths that I can take off potentially at the drum sander if these need any kind of cleanup on them. I don't think that the table saw cuts will need any cleanup. However, the jointer cut faces may need just a little bit of cleanup to take out the little divots that are left behind by the jointer. Okay, so then the next step is to get these cut to length. And I've got the leg boards oriented so that I can take a little bit off this end to clean up anything that looks rough and to square up the end. And then what I'll do is I'll slide this end of the board up against the stop block that's set down here, and that stop block is set at 33¼ inches, which is the desired height for these legs to account for the 3/4 inch thick top, and also the 1/2 inch plastic pad that'll be added onto the bottom of the legs. I have the boards for the table and the shelf here in the center of the workbench. These have been milled up surface 4 side. There's some obvious defects in some of these black walnut boards. Others are nearly perfect. So I'll need to see if I can come up with a way of taking care of these defects, little knot holes and whatnot. I don't have enough long boards here for the stretchers, which is going to be a little bit problematic. As I said, some of these boards are near perfect and others are just a little bit less than desired but can be used. So what I've done is I've started preparing a couple more boards here that will hopefully turn out to be some good black walnut. There's a board that's probably, it was over 12 inches wide. I've got it cut down to a little bit over 11 inches wide so that I can run it through the jointer and the planer. And then I've got 2 other boards here that are a bit narrower, probably about 9 inches across. And so I'll get these milled up, surface 4 side, and then see if I've got enough material to actually finish this table. I'm waiting on some materials from Amazon to show up for this project, and they should arrive in a couple days. So I think what I'll do, since this video is already about 30 minutes long, we'll end part 1 here, and then we'll continue with part 2 in a couple days in the next video. And I should be able to make some more progress with getting these boards milled up surface 4 sides before the start of that video. Hey, that's all for today. Thanks for watching. Bye.